Singapore on technology. You see, Singapore is a very easy case study because there are many innovations there, not only technological and management, but also policy and planning and in terms of communication. So let's see. Let me introduce Singapore. This is a city that has literally changed with time. At the time of the independence in 1965, 30% of the population lived in slums, 50% of the population was illiterate, and canals and waterways, they resemble open sewers. And only 20 years later, in 1985, all this had been addressed. With very high population growth, as we can see here, and land scarce and natural resources scarce, all this was a challenge. And how was it achieved? This was achieved because the first innovation has been planning in the long term and ahead of time. And this has included the supply of clean water and also the sanitation services. So, as Professor Biswas had mentioned before, in Singapore, a main innovation is that water is seen with the eyes of overall development. It's not a sector, but it's a means to achieve development. So what I'm going to explain is how sanitation relates to clean water supply, which is very much what Peter Glick said yesterday, when sanitation with wastewater becomes an input for water supply. So these are the ways in which Singapore gets water, which is the local catchment, imported water, new water, which is, I have a small bottle with me, which I bring with me all the time, and desalinated water. Singapore is very small, so we were talking about the how and the why. The reason why Singapore has developed so many innovations is because they need it. And because they are enlightened and they have an enlightened leader. So Singapore is very small, even after having grown by 20% with reclamation. They are only 720 square kilometers. But management has been very efficient, one more innovation. And so much that now water is collected from 60% of the land. So 2/3 of the land have become a catchment area. But this covers only 10% of the needs of Singapore. So from where does it get the water? Another source is imported water from neighbor Johor. And 50% of the water that Singapore uses comes from there. Except this source of water may finish in 2061, 50 years from now, because the agreement that was signed between Malaysia and Singapore expires that year. And nobody knows whether it will be renewed or not. But in the meantime, Singapore has not been able to import the 250 million gallons per day that it can import because there have been very severe droughts in Malaysia. So, according to the plans, and there are always plans in Singapore, this water may not be available, therefore more water has to be produced. And this is what brings me to the main innovation, which is the new water, the small bottle of water I showed to you before. The main innovation has been to recognize the value of wastewater as a resource, well ahead of the world, except for Windhoek in Namibia, but well ahead of the rest of the world. So how is this done? This is technology. Technology is the easiest part. What we need is management, governance, and then you can have technology. Technology is just the decoration, but you should have a robust system. So how is new water produced? All wastewater is collected and it is treated to very high quality. The water that is very, very high quality, it is sold to the industry, to the wafer industry. And actually the reason why the wafer industry came to Singapore was because they were able to get this water, which is very high quality. The rest of the water is discharged to the sea, except for that is needed for the reservoirs. So in the reservoirs, the new water is remineralized, and then it is pumped into the reservoirs, where it blends with water from Johor, desalinated water, and rainwater. But a main innovation was communication. When new water was ready, PUB, the National Water Agency, realized that lack of information could make that this project that is so important for the development of Singapore could be rejected, as it has happened somewhere else, like in some cities in Australia. So main challenge was public perception, and as everything else, it was addressed. So how was it addressed? It was addressed, and this brings me to the topic of this panel, which is by working together. The media, members of the parliament, and very important religious leaders, all of them were engaged. They were informed, the questions were addressed, and very important, they were explained the value of this resource for Singapore. There was massive information for the public when it was launched in 2003, and at the same day that New Water was launched, and there were all these there was a public meeting, and of course the Prime Minister was drinking the reused water, contrary to Mr. Carter. When he was asked to drink reused water, he said no. And that is a very strong message to the population. And there is a New Water Visitor Center. We don't have wastewater in Singapore, we have used water. We don't have sewage treatment plants, we have water reclamation plants. This was also part of this innovation in communication. Let's use more positive terms. This is not unique of Singapore. We have been studying what are the policies for public policies for water reuse, for potable use. We have a publication I have with me for people who are interested, where we have examples of Windhoek, several in United States, several in Europe, the one in Beijing. So in the case of Singapore, the trigger was the need. In the case of Windhoek was also the need, the lack of resource. And in the case of the rest of the world, it's because of climate change, climate variability. There is less rainfall, less by insurance, and the insurance is coming in the form of recycled wastewater and desalinated water. And this brings me to desalinated water, the fourth resource, natural resource, not produced resource, water resource for Singapore. Here, the innovation has been in terms of producing technology that is less energy intensive, both for desalinated water and for new water. In the case of new water, there are 4 plants. One more is under construction. In the case of desalinated water, there are 2 plants. One more is under construction, and the 4th one has been planned. And as Daniel Nolasco has said before with one example, the 4th plant will also have an energy plant. So those are the solutions, those are the innovations of Singapore at present. But then the future looks very different, not only for Singapore, but for the rest of the world. The present of Singapore is because it's smaller. 2061, 50 years from now, the plans for Singapore are to 2061, because the agreement with Malaysia expires in 2060. So the city-state should be ready by then. So as you can see, the water requirements will be doubled. How is that going to be covered if the imported water is not there? Well, with new water and with desalinated water. So whatever innovation has been, it has to be improved, because much more new water will be used, much more desalinated water, more energy intensive, or it should be less energy intensive. But this is based on technology, on management, on development, and on planning in the long term. Something very important is that Singapore has taken the advantage of producing new water, and it has developed a water industry, which is very strong. So many thousands of new employments. Disease is not one element, but is part of a strategy. So let's see, just to summarize, what are our innovations? And these are very simple things, but they are not done everywhere. That's why I mention them as innovations. One, the realization that the overall development of the city-states depends on its blue development, not on concrete development, not on financial development, even though Singapore is one of the financial centers of the world. And to the right-hand side, just below the timer, is the blue map, the one on which PUB, the National Water Agency, keeps an eye on. How much water are we collecting? Because we should treat it and we should protect it. One more innovation, I mentioned before, the long-term planning, management, technology, is the University of Singapore have the largest funding in the world on water resources research, because the idea is that this is applied research, that it has a positive impact on the country, and develop more efficient processes and less energy intensive. The research that is being done resembles nature, because well, nature is very efficient. So let's produce, this is the membrane and post-membrane area. Let's produce membranes. Let's go beyond membranes. Let's use materials that are less energy intensive, that they resemble nature, like these fishes that move from brackish water to fresh water, or like the mangroves. So this is research that is being done in Singapore. Diversification of water supply sources and protection. Why is this innovation? How is this different from somewhere else? Well, for the catchment areas in Singapore, is technology, is management. Bringing water from Johor has meant a lot of innovation in terms of diplomacy, and new water has been communication. Desalination is protection of the environment, where at the end you are discharging the brines. One more, reliable availability of water supplies in quantity and quality over the long term, where new water is a main component. Land is finite. Singapore cannot continue reclaiming anymore. So, but even then population is growing, even the economic development is growing. And this has not been limited because there are no natural resources. But the way Singapore plans is, what do we need to do in order to become the type of place we want to become? 90% of the food we all eat are imported. 100% of energy sources are imported. 50% of water is imported. But this is all under an overall framework of sustainability, self-reliance, and long-term planning. Now, this is very important. That brings us to the climate change part. Singapore has realized that the water supply systems it has are not robust during extreme events. So the extreme events, so-called extreme events we have in Singapore are only fortunately some flash floods and droughts. The last drought, which was in 2015, and that was severe for Singapore standard, was of 1 month. And by then there were talks as to whether somebody was going to rescue all of us 5.7 million people and take us somewhere else. But Singapore said, don't worry, we are under control. We can run Singapore the way it is, the same activities, without rainfall, without water from Malaysia for 1 year. So that means it's a robust system. But could it run more than that? So instead of answering yes or no, let's work for it and let's make systems more efficient. So finally, let me show you one more Singapore. A very urbanized area, a place that has grown in terms of land, landscape, population, very diverse, many different religions, and where there is a lot of concrete. Most of it is urbanized, and where 60% of the water, 60% of the land work as a catchment area. So this shows again the type of innovations. We were talking about the how, the why, and I thought this would be a very good example on how we can show how different sectors have worked together. The Public Utilities Board is a public sector utility. However, it uses private sector at every point, because the philosophy is that if the private sector can do something better than us, they are going to do it under our regulation. So I leave this with Singapore. This is a good example. Thank you very much.